The Mongol cavalry commander watches the enemy retreat and feels the familiar satisfaction of a battle already won. Ahead of him, across the floor of the Jezreel Valley, a detachment of mounted warriors is pulling back in visible disorder. Horses wheeling, riders breaking formation, the unmistakable geometry of a force that is engaged and lost its nerve. He has seen this 100 times. At Zhongdu, at Samarkand, at Baghdad just 2 years ago. An enemy vanguard makes contact, absorbs the first Mongol volleys, realizes it is overmatched, and runs. What follows is slaughter. The Mongol army has annihilated fleeing enemies across 2 continents. Pursuit is not a phase of battle. It is the phase of battle. The moment the enemy turns, the killing becomes mechanical. He signals the advance. His Tumans surge forward, compound bows loosing arrows into the retreating mass. The valley narrows between the slopes of Mount Gilboa and the hills south of the Nazareth Ridge. Good ground for a chase. The fleeing horsemen are being compressed. In minutes, his riders will close the distance, and the sabers will finish what the arrows started. Then the hills erupt. Heavy cavalry crashes into his flanks from concealed positions along the ridgeline. Hundreds of armored riders emerging from terrain his scouts should have cleared. These are not panic skirmishers. They are lancers in lamellar plate and mail, mounted on armored war horses, charging in disciplined formation with a coordinated violence that hits his extended column like a closing fist. The retreating vanguard ahead is no longer retreating. It has wheeled, reformed, and is now driving directly back into his leading elements. He is surrounded, and in the seconds before the impact crushes his formation entirely, the Mongol commander recognizes something that has never happened in the institutional memory of the Mongol Empire. Someone has just executed a feigned retreat against him. The signature tactic that Mongol armies have used to annihilate every opponent from China to Hungary. The disciplined false flight that draws an overconfident enemy into a prepared killing zone has been turned around and used with textbook precision by an army that rides, shoots, and maneuvers like steppe warriors. Because that is exactly what they are. By the summer of 1260, the Mongol Empire had achieved something no political entity in human history had accomplished. It controlled continuous territory from the Pacific coast of Korea to the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. Approximately 24 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface, governed by a single imperial authority. In 60 years of sustained conquest, Mongol armies had destroyed the Khwarezmian Empire, consumed the Jin and Western Xia dynasties of China, subjugated the kingdoms of Central Asia, crushed the principalities of Kiev and Rus, invaded Poland and Hungary, and, in February 1258, committed an act of destruction so vast it still reverberates through Islamic historical consciousness. They sacked Baghdad, the Abbasid Caliphate, spiritual and nominal center of Sunni Islam for over 5 centuries, ceased to exist in a single catastrophic week. Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan breached the walls, executed Caliph al-Mustasim by wrapping him in a carpet and trampling him beneath horses, and systematically dismantled the city. Libraries containing centuries of accumulated scholarship were dumped into the Tigris. Contemporary accounts, likely exaggerated but indicative of genuine devastation, claim hundreds of thousands of civilians perished. The river, chroniclers wrote, ran black with ink and red with blood on alternate days. From Baghdad, Hulagu moved west. Aleppo fell in January 1260 after a brief siege. Damascus surrendered without meaningful resistance in March. The Mongol frontier now stood at the edge of Egypt, the last major Islamic power between the Mongol Empire and total dominance of the Middle East. Hulagu dispatched envoys to Cairo, carrying a message to the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz, whose content was functionally identical to every Mongol ultimatum delivered to every doomed city for half a century. Submit or be annihilated. The formula had never failed. Every empire, dynasty, and kingdom that had received this message had either surrendered and been absorbed, or resisted and been destroyed. There was no third outcome in the Mongol operational catalog. Qutuz killed the envoys. He cut their heads from their bodies and mounted them on the gates of Cairo. Then he marched north to meet the Mongol army in open battle. It was, by any rational strategic calculation, an act of suicidal defiance. But Qutuz possessed something no previous Mongol adversary had commanded: an army specifically designed, through decades of institutional engineering, to fight exactly this kind of enemy. The word Mamluk means one who is owned. It is not a nationality, not an ethnicity, not a tribal affiliation. It is a condition. The Mamluks were slaves, purchased as boys, typically between the ages of 8 and 14, from the Kipchak Turkish tribes of the Central Asian steppe, from Circassian communities in the Caucasus, and from other non-Muslim populations along the frontiers of the Islamic world. Traders brought them south in caravans. Sultans and emirs bought them in markets. They were converted to Islam, given new names, stripped of every tribal identity and family connection they had ever known, and placed into military training barracks called Tibak within the citadels of Cairo and other garrison cities. What happened inside those barracks produced the most formidable heavy cavalry force of the medieval world. The training system was called Furusiya, a term that translates loosely as the science of horsemanship, but encompassed far more than riding. Furusiya was a comprehensive military curriculum covering mounted archery, lance combat, swordsmanship, wrestling, tactical formation drill, and battlefield signaling. Training lasted years. A Mamluk recruit spent his adolescence and early adulthood in continuous, structured martial education of an intensity and duration that had no equivalent in contemporary, European, Chinese, or even Mongol military practice. This distinction matters enormously. Mongol warriors were products of a pastoral steppe culture, where riding, hunting, and archery were survival skills absorbed organically from childhood. Every Mongol male grew up in the saddle, learned to shoot from horseback, and participated in great hunt drives, the Nurj, that functioned as large-scale military exercises. This produced superb light cavalry, but it was culturally transmitted skill, variable in quality, dependent on the lifestyle of the individual and his tribe. There was no standardized curriculum, no institutional mechanism ensuring uniform capability across every unit. The Mamluk system was precisely that mechanism. It took boys from the same steppe culture, Kipchak Turks who would have grown up to be the same kind of mounted warriors as the Mongols, and processed them through a structured, repeatable training program that produced soldiers of standardized elite quality. Every Mamluk graduate could execute the same mounted archery techniques, the same lance charges, the same formation maneuvers. The system didn't rely on cultural inheritance. It manufactured capability through institutional design, and it added something the steppe nomadic tradition did not prioritize: heavy shock combat. Mamluk cavalry combined the mounted archery and tactical mobility of their steppe origins with the armored lance charge of heavy cavalry doctrine. A Mamluk horseman wore lamellar armor, or mail, carried a composite bow functionally identical to the Mongol weapon, wielded a lance for shock engagement, and carried a saber for close combat. He could skirmish at range like a Mongol light cavalryman. He could execute massed charges like a European knight. He could do both within the same engagement, transitioning between modes with a fluency that neither European nor Mongol forces could replicate. The Mamluks were, in essence, a hybrid military technology. Steppe warrior capability, systematized through institutional training, enhanced with heavy equipment, and stripped of the tribal political fragmentation that was the Mongol army's greatest structural vulnerability when operating at the end of extended supply lines. Hulagu Khan had withdrawn the bulk of his forces eastward before Ain Jalut, recalled by a succession crisis following the death of Great Khan Möngke in 1259. He left a reduced force in Syria under his trusted general Kitbuka Noyan, a Nestorian Christian of Naiman Turkic origin, commanding perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 troops. The precise numbers are debated. Some sources suggest as few as 1 tumen. Others estimate higher. What is certain is that Kitbuka's force was significantly smaller than the army that had sacked Baghdad, and it was operating at the extreme western edge of Mongol logistical reach, without expectation of rapid reinforcement. Qutuz recognized the opportunity. He assembled approximately 12,000 to 20,000 Mamluk cavalry and marched north from Egypt through the Sinai into Palestine. His advance guard was commanded by Baybars, a Kipchak-born Mamluk of extraordinary tactical intelligence, who had already distinguished himself at the Battle of Mansoura against Crusader forces in 1250. Baybars led his detachment forward to make contact with the Mongol force and execute the most consequential tactical maneuver of the 13th century. He attacked Kitbuka's vanguard near the spring of Ain Jalut, the spring of Goliath, in the Jezreel Valley of modern Israel on September 3, 1260. He engaged aggressively enough to convince Kitbuka that the Mamluk force was committed. Then he withdrew. The withdrawal was not rout, it was choreography. Baybars pulled his detachment back through the valley floor in calculated disorder, close enough to fleeing to invite pursuit, controlled enough to maintain unit cohesion for the counterstroke. Kitbuka, seeing an enemy in apparent retreat, did what Mongol commanders had been trained to do for 3 generations. He pursued. His cavalry drove into the narrowing valley, extending their formation, accelerating to close the distance with the fleeing Mamluks. The terrain compressed his forces. The hills on either side rose steeply enough to conceal what was positioned behind them. Kutus had hidden the main Mamluk army on the high ground flanking the valley. When Kitbuka's force was fully committed to the pursuit, Kutus unleashed his heavy cavalry from both sides simultaneously. The impact was devastating. Mamluk lancers in full armor crashed into the extended Mongol column at multiple points, fragmenting it into isolated clusters. Baybars's retreating vanguard wheeled and charged back into the Mongol leading elements. Kitbuka's force was enveloped, struck from front, left and right, in a coordinated compression that eliminated the Mongol cavalry's primary tactical asset, the ability to maneuver freely and choose the terms of engagement. In the close quarters fighting that followed, the Mamluk advantages compounded. Their heavier armor absorbed blows that penetrated Mongol leather and light lamellar. Their lances delivered shock impact that unhorsed Mongol riders at contact. Their composite bows matched Mongol archery at range, while their armored mounts survived volleys that would have crippled unprotected steppe horses. And critically, the Mamluks understood Mongol small unit tactics, the circling harassment, the false retreats within retreats, the sudden concentrated volleys from unexpected angles, because these were tactics their own steppe-born instincts recognized intuitively. The Mongols could not surprise soldiers who had been raised in the same martial culture. Kitbuka refused to retreat, whether from personal courage, from the institutional Mongol prohibition against abandoning the field, or from the recognition that retreat against a faster enemy in a confined valley meant annihilation anyway. He fought until his horse was killed beneath him and he was captured. The Mamluks executed him. Accounts differ on the manner. Some sources describe a defiant exchange in which Kitbuka warned his captors that Hulagu would avenge him with an army that would turn the Nile red. The Mamluks were unmoved. The Mongol force was destroyed. Not merely defeated, functionally annihilated as a fighting formation. Survivors scattered into the Syrian countryside. Damascus, which had surrendered to the Mongols months earlier, revolted. Aleppo's Mongol garrison was overwhelmed. Within weeks, the entire Mongol position west of the Euphrates collapsed. Military historians argue endlessly about whether Ain Jalut was truly decisive or merely opportunistic, a product of Hulagu's convenient absence and Kitbuka's reduced force rather than fundamental Mamluk superiority. The debate has merit. Had Hulagu commanded the full imperial army, the outcome might have been different. The Mongols launched subsequent invasions of Syria in 1281, 1299, and 1303, winning tactical engagements but never re-establishing permanent control. The Mamluk Sultanate held the line for decades, eventually outlasting the Sultanate entirely. But the tactical significance transcends the strategic argument. At Ain Jalut, the Mongol army encountered, for the first time in its imperial history, an opponent that had reverse-engineered its own advantages and added capabilities the Mongol system could not match. The Mamluks possessed steppe mobility because their soldiers came from the steppe. They possessed steppe archery because their bows were the same weapons. They possessed the tactical vocabulary of nomadic cavalry warfare because it was encoded in the childhood muscle memory of men born on the Central Asian grasslands. But they also possessed what no steppe army had ever systematically developed: institutional standardization, heavy armor integration, and a training infrastructure that could produce elite warriors independent of tribal culture, seasonal migration, or the accidents of pastoral upbringing. The Mamluk system didn't rely on a population of hereditary horse nomads. but they had never been defeated by an army that understood them so completely, that could read their tactics in real time, counter their feigned retreats with feigned retreats of its own, match their archery, exceed their armor, and fight the close-quarters battle that Mongol doctrine was designed to avoid. The Mamluks did not defeat the Mongols by building a bigger army, or a braver one, or a more technologically advanced one. They defeated them by constructing a system that took the Mongol warriors' own raw ingredients, step-born horsemanship, composite bow mastery, tactical fluidity, and ran them through an institutional process that the tribal structure of the Mongol Empire could never replicate. The answer to the most dominant military system on Earth was not its opposite. It was its reflection, sharpened, armored, and professionalized until the mirror image surpassed